in the messaging world, and he will be with us in two sessions during the day, and then this evening he will speak at the feed mill for dinner. And you can register at lunch. There's a few slots left, and first come, first serve registration during the lunch hour will get you access to that dinner tonight. George Lakoff.
How many of you would like to follow John Nichols as a speaker? Have any of you ever had a cold? I suspect a few of you have. I have one, so I'm going to be a little bit quieter than John, and maybe a little slower. So bear with me in case, because I have a little bit of a sore throat. First of all, thank you all for coming. When my wife asked me why I wanted to go to Wisconsin, I said, remember that protest in the Capitol when Walker did his thing? Remember all those people out there? That's why. I want to say something about me. I'm not a 10th generation American, I'm a 2nd generation American. And I am, however, the first generation in my family. My brother and I are both the first generation in the history of our family to go to high school. My mother worked 25 years in a factory from the age of 12. Then she ran a rooming house for 17 years after that before retiring. So my father had to start working when he was 13 in a butcher store, then later on in a slaughterhouse. Then took a night school course and worked for the General Accounting Agency, and during World War II was one of the major whistleblowers on the cheating of the American government by large corporations that he uncovered in the Government Accounting Agency. Yeah, all those guys. So basically, I have a proud heritage. And I don't forget it. I'm here because you're here, and I want to start with a little, again, Lisa told us a lot of the facts about the organization on the right. You know what the Leadership Institute is in Virginia? The Leadership Institute trains tens of thousands of conservatives a year to think and talk conservative. And they've been doing this for 30 to 40 years, and they're in 15 countries right now. This is not a small operation. This is part of the whole thing. They keep track of those guys. They're all over the country, and they have a booking agency to book them on radio shows, TV shows, and all sorts of venues every day. So it's not just Fox News. What you hear on Fox News is what's going out on the computer to all these guys and going out through the booking agencies and all over the place. This is, been known to the Democratic Party for a long time, done nothing about it. What's been going on with ALEC has been known since ALEC started, done nothing about it. They've just started ALICE, which is finally a reaction to that for progressive work at the local level. I just came back 2 weeks ago from talking to the Democratic municipal officials in Washington at their meeting, and also to the American Windmill Association at their meeting, and to the Democracy Initiative, which is another progressive initiative, which is another organization starting up there. We're finally getting organized, and it's about time, and I want to talk about what that means, and the difference between material power and cognitive power, the power of the mind, and how that works. because material power always depends upon cognitive power, and the right wing understands this thoroughly. And over the day, I'll go through this in very great detail. But first, I want to start with a little bit of very basic stuff. All politics is moral. Any political leader who gets up and says, "Do what I do," presumably is saying, because it's right. Nobody gets up and says, "Do what I do because it's wrong, because it's awful, it's terrible, but do it." Nobody says that. Nobody gets up there and says, "Do what I say because it doesn't matter, it's kind of random, but just do it." So that when you get political leaders saying opposite things, it's because they have opposite views of what's right and wrong. And that is extremely important, because the folks on the right understand their moral system. We have a moral system that we don't talk about. We talk about the facts. We talk about our history. We talk about the issues one by one. All right. We don't talk about what unites them morally. And that is where we have to start. So that's one of the reasons I want to be here today. Because it turns out that when you think about all of those people in Clark County who are voting for your governor, all those people are not bad people. They're not bad people. They're people who have a different sense of what counts as moral. And they've heard that through the conservative communication system for the past 40 years. They've heard it over and over again. Now, why does that matter? It matters for the second reason, which is you think with your brains. You don't have a choice. All thought is physical. That's what I do. I'm a cognitive scientist and linguist. I study all of those things. And the way that this works is every thought you have is physically there in the neural system of your brain. It's in a neural circuit. And as a result, you can only understand what your physical brain allows you to understand. If you don't have the right neural circuitry, then it's going one ear and out the other. And it turns out that people who have a very different view of what counts as moral have a different set of circuits in their brains. They will understand things very differently. In particular, they will understand the facts very differently. If the facts don't fit what's in their brains, they're not going to be heard. They're not going to be understood. They're going to be dismissed. So that is the first thing to understand. The second thing is we're going to go through the conservative moral system as well as the progressive one. And this is something not discussed in polite circles in politics. People don't go out and talk about the fact that there isn't one moral system going in the country. There are two opposing ones. But what is most interesting about that is that there are a lot of people, probably more than a third, who have parts of both systems in their brains because we've been brought up by maybe different fathers and mothers, different communities. We watch movies with both of those systems in them. And what happens is that you get people who have both a conservative moral system and a progressive moral system, partly, one or the other. What is a moderate? There is no ideology of the moderate. There's no general set of principles that all people who are moderates have. It doesn't happen. A moderate conservative is partly progressive on certain things. A moderate, progressive is partly conservative on various different things. There's no middle. There is no middle. What you have are people who are what I'll call biconceptual, who have both views about different things, mostly one, mostly the other, partly the other. And then the question is, how does that work? How is it possible in one brain to have two moral systems that contradict each other? Now, that this is true is very clear. Let me give you a very common non-political example. Imagine the moral systems on Saturday night and Sunday morning. Right? People don't even notice that there's a shift, but there is. And the way this works in brains is very simple. All through the brain, there are circuits called mutual inhibition, where one circuit inhibits the other. Whichever one is most active, the other is smaller. And if one is regularly activated over and over and over, the other is deactivated over and over. And the more that a neural circuit is activated in your brain, the stronger it gets. And if it is inhibiting the other, the weaker it gets. So that if one hears conservative language over and over and over, what's going to happen is, even if they have progressive thoughts, they're going to get weakened. And if progressives use the conservative language, they're shooting themselves in the foot. Namely, they're helping conservatives, and we'll go through that in detail, because that is happening here in Wisconsin and throughout the country. So that's part one. Part two has to do with what are called frames. A frame is a very simple thing. Every thought you have uses a frame. Let me explain. Imagine a frame for a restaurant. Okay? What happens in a restaurant? You go to a restaurant, you expect certain things. You expect waiters, menus. You expect a chef to cook something. You expect dishes to be brought to you, a check afterwards, and so on. There are certain things that don't happen in restaurants, luckily. You go to a restaurant, you're not going to get a herd of elephants coming through, hopefully. You go to a restaurant and they're not going to wheel in a patient to be operated on in front of you, right? Those are for hospitals, and it costs a different frame. Everything you understand about any social institution or structure, or physical structure, is structured in terms of frames which have things like waiters and chefs, which are called semantic roles, and scenarios that you can count on to happen. Those are normal. You can't think about anything. You can't think about anything without a frame. And what my late colleague, who died last month, Charles Fillmore, discovered back in 1975, is that every word in every language of the world is defined relative to these neural frames, to these frames in your brain. And whenever you have a word and you say that word, some frame is activated in your brain. It's going to be stronger. If that word is said over and over, that's going to matter. Now, Chuck Fillmore taught me something very deep about this back in 1977. Chuck, we went to coffee one day in Berkeley, and Chuck said, there's a trial going on in Boston that's just ended. And a doctor who performed an abortion was on trial for murder. And in that trial, the prosecuting attorney used the word baby, and the defense attorney used the word fetus. And that's what the trial was about. That is, whichever frame dominates wins. Right? Remember that. It's everywhere. When I was first asked to speak to a retreat of the Democrats in the U.S. Senate, I was asked to explain what a frame was. And I gave a simple example. This was back in 2003. I said, when George Bush first came into office, on his first day, he used the expression tax relief. And on the second day, and the third day, and every day after that for months, was written in every speech he gave. And if you think about it, the word relief has a frame. It says, there's some affliction that you have, and it requires being taken away. It's a bad thing, it harms you. And if someone gives you relief, they're a hero, they're a good guy. And if someone tries to stop them from relieving that affliction, they're bad people. And you have tax relief says, by a metaphor, that taxation is an affliction. That's a conservative metaphor that's in there. And when you hear it over and over again, you're getting that conservative worldview. Why? Because all politics is moral, and there is a conservative worldview, and the frames are structured hierarchically, something Fillmore discovered. And in politics, the highest part of the hierarchy is political morality. Whether you're progressive or conservative, there's a certain moral view that you have, And all frames fit that moral view. And when you activate that frame, you activate the entire moral view and all the other related frames. That is, issues are not isolated. They all come together behind single moral positions. And so what we're going to do is talk about what those moral positions are, how they work, and why you shouldn't just be thinking of one issue and another issue and another issue as if voting rights were separate from fracking, as if fracking were separate from education and so on. They're all part of one thing, the way you understand what this country is about. And we're going to get into that in detail because it has to do with a moral view that we have about the country. Now, the next thing that's really important to think about is this. What is it that unites all the particular issues that conservatives support? This is a question I asked in 1994 when I read a book called The Contract with America, written by Frank Luntz. Some of you will remember that book. I have a lot of civic duty. Every year I watch the Republican National Convention out of civic duty. In fact, in 1992, I was sitting in my living room watching it, and I particularly wanted to hear Dan Quayle's acceptance speech. Some of you will remember this vice president who is not one of our stellar vice presidents. But I wanted to hear a speech because it was written by William Crystal, who was a major theorist on the right. And in that speech, as I listened to it, I realized that I didn't understand Dan Quayle. I understood every word and every sentence. I had no idea how these sentences fit together. But I realized that it wasn't Quayle, it was William Crystal writing this speech. So I said, something must be going on here. So I said, okay, I'm a linguist, I'm going to remember an example. Okay? Here was the example I committed to memory. It was Dan Quayle's argument against the progressive income tax, and it was a one-sentence argument. Now, how do you argue against the progressive income tax in one sentence if you're a Republican at the convention? Here's the sentence. Why should the best people be punished? And they all, cheered and waved their signs. And I'm sitting there saying, why is this an argument against the progressive income tax? Now, I'm going to remember this, okay? Now, it became a little clearer in 1994 when the Contract with America came out. And I read it and I said, these are very weird people. What does being against abortion have to do with the flat tax? What does the flat tax have to do with owning guns? What does owning guns have to do with getting rid of environmental legislation? What does that have to do with tort reform? I just didn't get it. And I said, but this is not just an ordinary person saying this. I'm a professor at Berkeley in cognitive science. This is my field. I'm supposed to know this. So I said, okay, I'm going to take this as an academic challenge. I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to just do the research as a cognitive science problem. And so what I did was I read lots of speeches, I read news reports, I read books, everything I could get my hand on. I interviewed people, person after person. For 6 months I got nowhere until I remembered